Hey all, it's Kim Dellow here with a new project video, and this week I'm using the new stamps and stencils that I designed for PaperArtsy. They've just been released, February 2017, and I've used them to make this layered watercolour journal page. So sit tight as I walk you through my whole process. I'm working on a piece of Bockingford cold press watercolour paper, and if you want to minimise warping of the paper, because I'm going to be using quite a lot of water, then you might want to stretch the paper first and tape it down to a board. But I'm not going to bother with this as it doesn't really matter. This is just a play piece for me, so I'm not worried if it warps at the end. It's just going to go into my art journal and that will be it. The first thing I'm going to do is roughly put down some colour, and I'm using Winsor Newton watercolour paints for this, and I'm going to use a wide flat brush. And the wide flat brush will just cover the area quite quickly, but it will also give some good textures to the sides and the edges. You kind of need to work quickly at this point because you want the paint to still be wet when you place a stencil over the top. Now this stencil I'm using, this is one of my new PaperArtsy stencils. It's PSO 40 and has a retro abstract shape look to it. Now I'm just using some water to lift and move the pigment around. But there's a balance between using enough water that moves the pigment but not so much that you flood the area. So if you aren't sure, use less water and add if you need to. I'm also going to add a few grains of coarse salt to some of the wet spaces. Then I'm going to let the stencil and the salt stay in place whilst the paint dries naturally. It will take longer than you think for the paint to dry as it pools onto the stencil, and where it pools it will take longer for the water to evaporate. So be patient and leave it for several hours. When you come to take the stencil off, do it carefully, lift it up slowly so that if any of the paint has stuck to the stencil, then it won't tear the paper, and also if it isn't dry yet, then you won't smear the paint. And I've perhaps taken mine off a little bit earlier than I would have wanted to, but I was a bit pressed for time. Next, you want to carefully knock the salt off the surface, and I keep the salt in a small bag to use again in other projects. Time for some stamping, and I'm going to be using all three of my new sets from PaperArtsy, and that's EKD04, 05 and 06. I'm going to use masking and layering to build up my image, so I need to stamp the image that will be in the foreground first, and then stamp it again on spare paper to make a mask. Now before you do any stamping, make sure that the surface is completely dry, and this paper has a texture to it as I'm using a cold press paper, so I need to make sure that I ink up the stamp really well. Or if you're unhappy about stamping on textured paper, use a stamping tool. Any of the positioning tools will work really well with this technique. So if you've got a MISTI or any of those sorts of things, use that and you can re-stamp over the top without having to worry about lining up the image in the stamp again. So now that I've got my focal point in place, I'm going to cover it with the masks that I've made and then stamp the large frame from EKD04 over the top. I'm actually using layout paper to make my masks as I like the thinner paper, but you can use ordinary printer paper as well. I'm going to stamp the smaller frame from EKD05 over the top, keeping the butterfly mask in place. So I designed these two frames to work together, so they are actually a matching pair, so they work really well as layers, but you can use them separately as well. I want to add the big flower from EKD06 in the background, so I'm just going to stamp the large frame onto layout paper and cut it out to make a mask. So this time, I'm going to ink up the large flower and stamp it over the top. Then I'm going to stamp it again onto layout paper to make my final mask. And for this final mask, I want to use it so that I can stamp out the texture stamp from EKD05, and I'm going to stamp it at the top on the right and then on the bottom on the left. So it's just running underneath the frame. To finish the piece, I'm going to add a bit of colouring to make the stamping layers just stand out a little bit more. At this point I wasn't sure what I wanted to use, so I've got a collection of things on my desk. But in the end I used the watercolour pencils and some iridescent gold watercolour paint. But sit back and watch me colour this piece, and I'll catch you again at the end of the video. that this page is absolutely packed full of texture, from that very first setting down of colour with the flat brush, to the adding the stencil, the layering of the stamps and the colouring. Just lots and lots of lovely textures and layers. So I hope you enjoyed watching this journal page come together and that you find some of the techniques useful for your own projects. As always, the products that I've used are listed below, and if you have any questions, just drop them in the comments section. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.